She lived alone in the village for 100 years. No one knew her secret. Until the night they saw the tales. Welcome to local legends. Today, Kitsune, the lantern light, spills across the wooden floor of the old house at the edge of the village, casting shadows that seem to move independently of their source. Outside, the bamboo forest whispers in the night wind, a sound like silk being drawn across paper. The house has stood here longer than anyone can remember, longer than the oldest grandmother in the village, longer than the shrine keeper's grandfather, longer than the record books kept at the town hall. Inside, a woman sits by the hearth, her face unlined, despite what the village records say about her age. She does not move, she simply watches the fire, and in the orange glow, her eyes catch the light in a way that seems animal, reflective. Wrong. The smell of wood smoke mingles with something else. Fox musk, perhaps. Or wild ginger growing along the forest path. A cricket chirps once, then falls silent. The tatami mats are old but immaculately kept. The sliding doors are paper thin, painted with autumn grasses and creatures that might be foxes, or might be dogs. It is hard to tell in the dim light. Nothing in the house suggests anything unusual. And yet the villagers have learned over generations not to visit after dark, not to ask too many questions, not to wonder why she never seems to age, why her pantry is always stocked, though no one sees her shop, why foxes gather at the edge of her property on certain nights and sit in perfect rows, watching the house with intelligent, patient eyes. Tonight, the wind shifts. A child lost on the mountain path stumbles into the clearing where her house stands. Through the paper door, the child sees her silhouette. And then, just for a moment, the shadow cast against the shoji screen is not the shadow of a woman at all. It is something with multiple tails, fanned out behind it like the fingers of a hand. The child runs. By morning, the village will know, and the woman who has lived among them for a century will finally reveal what she has always been. Kitsune. The Japanese archipelago is a place where mountains meet the sea, where dense forests give way to terraced rice fields, where the boundary between the cultivated and the wild has always been narrow and carefully maintained. For thousands of years, the people who have lived on these islands have understood their world as one of constant negotiation between the human and the other. Than, human, between the villages and the forests, between order and wildness, between what is knowable and what must remain mysterious. This is not a metaphor. In Shinto belief, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, the natural world is alive with kami spirits or deities that inhabit mountains, rivers, trees, stones, and animals. The fox, above all other creatures, occupies a unique and complex position in this cosmology. The fox in Japan is not merely an animal. It is kitsune, a word that carries with it centuries of accumulated meaning: trickster, messenger, seducer, guardian, demon, deity. The fox is shapeshifter and sorceress, faithful servant and dangerous lover. It is both the sacred attendant of Inari, the Shinto deity of rice, fertility and prosperity, and the wild spirit of the mountains and forests, operating according to its own inscrutable logic. This duality, this simultaneous sacredness and danger, defines the kitsune in Japanese cultural imagination and distinguishes it from fox figures in other traditions. Geographically, Japan's landscape reinforces this duality. The country is heavily forested, with approximately 67% of its land covered by mountains and woods. Historically, most of the population lived in villages and towns clustered in valleys, plains, and coastal areas, while the mountains and deep forests remained largely uninhabited, spaces of the wild, the sacred, and the unknown. Foxes thrived in these liminal zones, in the bamboo groves at the edges of villages, in the hills above the rice paddies, in the forests surrounding shrines. They were seen constantly, their presence woven into daily life. Yet they remained fundamentally apart. Creatures of the threshold. The people who lived in these landscapes developed an intricate relationship with foxes over millennia. Archaeological evidence suggests that foxes have been significant in Japanese culture since at least the J-Feimon period, approximately 14,000 to 300 BCE, with fox bones found in ritual contexts at various sites. By the Nara period, 710 to 794 CE, written records begin to document both the veneration of foxes as messengers of Inari and the fear of foxes as possessing spirits. The Nihon Rai Feiki, a collection of Buddhist tales compiled around 822 CE, includes some of the earliest written accounts of foxes taking human form and entering into relationships, usually romantic or deceptive, with human beings. In the spiritual worldview of early and medieval Japan, foxes occupied a space that was neither entirely good nor entirely evil, neither wholly divine nor purely demonic. They were ayakashi, strange beings, supernatural entities that existed in the spaces between categories. This ambiguity is crucial to understanding the Kitsune tradition. Unlike Western demonology, which tends to draw sharp distinctions between angels and devils, the Japanese supernatural world has always been more fluid, more willing to accommodate contradiction and complexity. A fox could be sacred at one shrine and feared as a malevolent spirit in the next village. The same type of being could bring prosperity or madness, depending on circumstances, intentions, and the quality of one's relationship with it. The connection between foxes and Inari worship became formalized during the Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, when Inari shrines proliferated throughout Japan. Inari, originally an agricultural deity associated with rice cultivation, became one of the most widely worshipped figures in Japan, and foxes were understood as Inari's messengers and servants, kenzoku. At Inari shrines, stone fox statues, Kitsune, flank the entrances, often depicted holding symbolic objects: a jewel, tama representing the spirit of Inari, or wishes fulfilled, a key to the rice granary representing prosperity, or a scroll representing wisdom. These foxes are typically white or red in color, distinguishing them from ordinary wild foxes. They are called byako, white foxes, or more formally Inari, Sama no Kenzoku, servants of Inari. But even as certain foxes were venerated as divine messengers, others were feared as Yako field foxes, or Nogitsune, wild foxes, spirits of the untamed places, capricious and potentially dangerous. These wild fox spirits were believed to possess human beings, causing a condition known as Kitsune, Suki fox possession. The symptoms of fox possession included speaking in strange voices, exhibiting personality changes, craving foods associated with foxes, especially fried tofu or aberrage, losing the ability to eat rice, barking, or making fox-like sound, and experiencing physical ailments that had no apparent medical cause. In some regions, entire families or clans were believed to be kitsune, mochi, fox, owners or fox, users, people who had made pacts with fox spirits and could command them to possess others or perform magical tasks. These families were often ostracized, feared as witches or sorcerers. This belief in fox possession was not relegated to ancient superstition. It persisted well into the modern era, particularly in rural areas. Anthropologist Carmen Blacker, in her 1975 study The Catalpa Bow, a study of shamanistic practices in Japan, documented cases of fox possession belief in 1960s Japan, noting that while urban, educated Japanese might dismiss such beliefs as backwards, they remained vital and feared realities in certain communities. Exorcisms of fox spirits performed by Buddhist monks, Shinto priests, or itinerant religious specialists called Yamabushi mountain ascetics, were still practiced in some regions into the late 20th century. The rural landscape of Japan, particularly in regions like Shiman, Tottori, and the mountainous interior of Honshu, provided the physical and cultural context for these beliefs. In villages surrounded by forest, where foxes were a daily presence, and where the reach of centralized religious or governmental authority was limited, older beliefs persisted. The fox was both neighbor and other, familiar and utterly alien, a creature that could be seen trotting across a field at dusk, or heard crying in the mountains at night. A cry that sounds disturbingly like a human child's scream. In this environment, the line between the natural and supernatural was not clearly drawn. A fox was always potentially more than a fox. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life reinforced these beliefs. Foxes were associated with the transition between seasons, particularly autumn, when they mate and their cries are most frequently heard. They were associated with the rice harvest, with prosperity and fertility, but also with the decay of autumn, with the dying of the year, with the thin times when the veil between worlds grows permeable. The phenomenon known as Kitsune, no Yomeri, the fox's wedding, strange lights or fires seen moving in procession through the mountains or fields at night, was interpreted as fox spirits conducting their own ceremonies, mirroring and mocking human rituals. These lights, probably natural phenomena such as bioluminescence, the wisps, or distant lanterns distorted by atmospheric conditions, took on supernatural significance because they appeared in fox country. In the liminal hours, the Kitsune, as it appears in Japanese legend and literature, is a being of profound magical ability and intelligence. It is first and foremost a shapeshifter capable of assuming human form, most commonly that of a beautiful woman. The transformation is not always perfect. Certain telltale signs may reveal a kitsune's true nature. The shadow it casts might be that of a fox regardless of the human form it wears. Its reflection in water might show fox ears or a tail. It might be unable to fully hide all of its tails, particularly in moments of strong emotion, or when caught off guard. Its eyes might reflect light like an animal's. And most tellingly, it might be unable to disguise its fear and hatred of dogs, which are said to be able to see through fox magic, and will bark frantically or attack when a kitsune is near. Physical descriptions of kitsune vary by region and by the type of fox spirit in question. In their true form, kitsune are usually described as larger than ordinary foxes, with fur that may be red, white, black, or golden. The most significant physical feature is the number of tails. A fox spirit grows additional tails as it ages and accumulates power and wisdom. A young kitsune might have only 1 or 2 tails. An ancient, powerful kitsune can possess up to 9 tails. Kifeibi no kitsune, 9-tailed fox, making it one of the most formidable supernatural beings in Japanese mythology. The process of growing additional tails is said to take centuries. Some accounts suggest a new tail appears every 100 years, while others link tail growth to the accumulation of knowledge, magical power, or spiritual enlightenment. The abilities attributed to kitsune are extensive and varied. Beyond shape-shifting, they include kitsune by foxfire, the ability to generate ghostly flames or lights, often seen as balls of fire floating through the air or hovering near the fox's mouth or tails. These fires do not burn like ordinary flames. They are cold, or they burn only what the fox wishes them to burn. They can be used to lead travelers astray, to illuminate the fox's path, or as a weapon. Possession, the ability to enter a human being's body or mind, causing madness, illness, or behavioral changes. The possessed person might speak with the fox's voice, exhibit fox-like behaviors, or be compelled to act according to the fox's will. Possession could be temporary or long-term, and in severe cases, the human personality might be entirely subsumed by the fox spirit. Illusion, the creation of elaborate false realities. A kitsune might make a small hut appear as a magnificent palace, or create phantom landscapes, people, or events. These illusions could be so convincing that a human might live within one for years, unaware of the deception until the magic was broken. Unlike simple tricks, these illusions were said to have a kind of reality. Food eaten within an illusion would satisfy hunger, at least temporarily, dream manipulation, the ability to enter and control human dreams, to send prophetic visions, to drive someone mad through nightmares, or to communicate across distances by appearing in the dreams of others. Flight. Some accounts describe powerful kitsune as able to fly or to move with supernatural speed, traveling great distances instantly. Longevity and immortality. Foxes, as supernatural beings, age extremely slowly, if at all. A kitsune that appears as a young woman might be centuries old. The most powerful are effectively immortal, though they can be killed by certain means. In terms of weaknesses and countermeasures, kitsune are particularly vulnerable to dogs, as mentioned, which can see through their illusions and whose very presence disrupts their magic. They are also said to fear certain Buddhist sutras and the prayers of monks, particularly the Heart Sutra. Physical objects that can ward off or harm kitsune include Buddhist rosaries, juzu, salt, and in some traditions, iron. If a human can obtain a fox's hoshi no tama starball, a magical pearl or jewel that contains the fox's power and possibly its soul, the fox becomes completely subservient to that person and must obey their commands or beg for the jewel's return. The distinction between types of kitsune is crucial for understanding the tradition. At the most basic level, kitsune are divided into two categories: Zenko, good foxes, and Yako, bad foxes, literally, field foxes. Zenko are associated with Inari and tend to be benevolent, serving as guardians, bringing prosperity, and helping humans. They are usually depicted with white or golden fur. Yako are wild fox spirits, unaffiliated with any deity, and are more likely to trick, possess, or harm humans. They are often described with red or black fur. However, this division is not absolute. Even Zenko can be dangerous if offended, and Yako are not necessarily evil. They may simply be amoral, operating according to their own interests and nature, rather than human moral categories. Some traditions recognize more specific varieties. The Kei-Feiko void fox, or Aku, Rai-Fei evil spirit, represents the most malevolent type of fox spirit, actively harmful to humans. The Ninko human fox is a fox that has achieved particularly skillful human form and often forms long-term relationships with humans, sometimes living among them for years, or even marrying them. The Tengu Kitsune, heavenly fox, or Tenko, is a fox that has achieved divine or semi. In literature and legend, individual kitsune display distinct personalities, motivations, and moral characters. They are not a monolithic category of beings, but rather individuals with their own histories, desires, and relationships to the human world. Some serve deities faithfully. Some seek revenge for wrongs done to them. Some fall in love with humans and try desperately to maintain their relationships, despite the inevitable revelation of their true nature. Some are merely hungry and trick humans to obtain food. Some are curious about human society and take human form to experience it. Some are ancient scholars who have accumulated vast knowledge and take students or grant wisdom to worthy seekers. This complexity, this recognition of individuality and motivation, distinguishes Japanese fox legends from simpler folkloric traditions about shape-changing spirits. The question of origin, how a fox becomes a kitsune, or how the kitsune tradition itself originated, admits multiple answers depending on whether one is asking about the supernatural logic within the tradition or the historical development of the belief system. Within the logic of the legends themselves, foxes become kitsune through age, through spiritual cultivation, or through divine appointment. The most common explanation is that an ordinary fox, if it lives long enough, typically cited as 50 or 100 years, naturally accumulates spiritual power and intelligence, eventually gaining the ability to shapeshift and perform magic. This is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual process of awakening and empowerment. The fox begins to understand human speech, then to think in increasingly complex ways, then to manipulate the spiritual energies, key that flow through all things. Eventually, it achieves the ability to take human form. This process is sometimes called henka, or henge transformation, and a fox that has achieved this state is a henge, Kitsune, transforming fox. In some accounts, this transformation is linked to religious or spiritual practice by the fox itself. Foxes are described as practicing Buddhist meditation, as studying Buddhist sutras, as performing austerities in the mountains, or as making pilgrimages to holy sites. In these stories, the fox is not merely aging into power, but actively cultivating wisdom and spiritual advancement, much as a human Buddhist practitioner might seek enlightenment. This reflects the influence of Buddhism on Japanese fox beliefs, the idea that any sentient being, human, animal, or spirit, can pursue enlightenment and transcend its current state. A fox practicing the Dharma might eventually achieve a kind of enlightenment, becoming a tenko or celestial fox, rising above the cycle of deception and hunger that characterizes lesser fox spirits. Another pathway is through divine appointment or association. A fox that becomes a messenger or servant of Inari is elevated above ordinary foxes, granted specific powers and responsibilities. These foxes do not necessarily transform in the same way as wild kitsune. They are fundamentally part of the divine order from the beginning, or at least from the moment of their dedication to Inari's service. Their nature is determined by their role rather than by age or cultivation. The cosmological role of kitsune in Japanese belief is multifaceted. They are intermediaries, beings that exist between the human and divine realms, between the ordered world of villages and the wild world of mountains and forests. They police boundaries and sometimes cross them. In agricultural contexts, kitsune, particularly Inari's foxes, are associated with the prosperity of the land, with successful harvests, with the protection of stored grain. Their presence at shrines marks sacred space. Their statues guard entrances, warding off evil spirits while welcoming legitimate worshippers. In this role, they are fundamentally protective, embodying the deity's benevolent power. But kitsune also embody danger, the danger of the untamed, the danger of deception, the danger of desire. The wild fox spirits represent the constant threat that exists beyond the village's boundaries, the reminder that the natural world is not subject to human control, that intelligence and agency exist in forms that do not share human values or obey human rules. Fox possession represents the ultimate boundary violation, the loss of one's own self. Many of the most famous kitsune legends involve the breaking of taboos, or the transgression of boundaries, particularly around sexuality and marriage. The archetype of the fox wife, a kitsune, who takes human form, marries a human man, and lives as his wife for years, often bearing children, appears throughout Japanese literature and folklore. These stories typically follow a pattern. A man encounters a beautiful woman under mysterious circumstances. She becomes his wife, and proves to be ideal, beautiful, skilled, devoted. She bears him children. They are happy. Then, through some accident or violation of a prohibition, the husband breaks a promise never to watch her at certain times, or a dog sees through her disguise, or someone from her fox life comes to reclaim her. Her true nature is revealed. The reaction varies. Sometimes the husband rejects her in horror. Sometimes he begs her to stay. Usually she must leave, returning to her fox form, though she may continue to watch over her children or provide for her family from a distance. Zone of the most complete versions of. In this narrative, a man named Abe no Yasuna rescues a white fox from hunters in the Shinoda forest near Osaka. Later, a woman named Kuzunoha appears at his home and becomes his wife. They have a son, Abe no Seimei, who will grow up to become the most famous Onmi-Feiji practitioner of Onmi-Feifei, a system of natural science, divination, and magic in Japanese history. One day, Yasuna returns home unexpectedly and sees his wife in her true form, a white fox. Knowing she has been discovered, Kuzunoha flees back to the forest, leaving behind a farewell poem written on the shoji screen. Despite being revealed as a fox, Kuzunoha's love for her son remains, and she is said to have continued protecting him throughout his life, granting him supernatural powers and wisdom. This story is particularly significant because it makes the connection between fox lineage and magical ability explicit. Seime's extraordinary powers as an Onmifeiji are attributed to his half-fox heritage. The taboo in these fox wife stories often involves prohibition against looking, against seeing the wife in certain contexts or at certain times. This mirrors a widespread folkloric motif found in the Greek story of Cupid and Psyche, in the Japanese story of Izanagi and Izanami, in countless fairy tales, in which forbidden knowledge or forbidden sight destroys a supernatural marriage. The taboo represents the fragile nature of the boundary between human and non-human, the understanding that such unions are always conditional, always dependent on the maintenance of certain fictions or limitations. To see one's wife as a fox is to acknowledge that the boundary has been crossed in a way that cannot be undone, that the relationship was always built on a form of deception, however benevolent. But Kitsune legends also involve more sinister taboos and violations. The phenomenon of fox possession, Kitsune, Suki, was surrounded by complex beliefs about cause, blame, and cure. Possession could occur because a person offended a fox, killed a fox, destroyed a fox's den, failed to make proper offerings at an Inari shrine, or insulted a family suspected of being fox users. It could occur because a person was spiritually weak, morally compromised, or simply unlucky. It could be deliberately caused by a kitsune, mochi family sending their fox to possess an enemy. The victim of possession was simultaneously patient and polluted, requiring both healing and, in some cases, social isolation. The treatment of fox possession involved exorcism rituals that could be lengthy and elaborate. Buddhist monks might chant sutras, particularly the Heart Sutra or Lotus Sutra, for hours or days. The possessed person might be forced to consume foods that foxes supposedly hate, or be subjected to physical ordeals. The exorcist might negotiate with the possessing fox, asking what it wants, what offense caused it to possess the victim, what offering or promise would induce it to leave. These negotiations were recorded in some cases, creating transcripts in which the fox spirit, speaking through the victim's mouth, makes demands, complains of mistreatment, or reveals information about its nature and history. These transcripts, found in temple records and in the accounts of religious practitioners, provide a strange window into the performative and psychological dimensions of possession belief. The scholar Komatsu Kazuhiko, in his research on yokai supernatural beings in Japanese culture, has analyzed fox possession as a social phenomenon, noting that it often provided a culturally sanctioned way for individuals, particularly women, to express grievances, to speak in ways they normally could not, or to exhibit behaviors that would otherwise be unacceptable. A possessed person could rage, could make accusations, could demand things, could behave wildly. And all of this would be attributed to the fox, not to the person's own will. The possession and subsequent exorcism functioned as a form of psychological and social release, a ritual through which tensions could be expressed and resolved. The moral weight of Kitsune legends, then, is complex. They are not simple cautionary tales about avoiding foxes or trusting strangers. They are meditations on the nature of boundaries, between human and animal, between order and wildness, between knowledge and ignorance, between self and other. They acknowledge the permeability of these boundaries, while also marking them as significant and dangerous. They suggest that love and deception, wisdom and trickery, sacredness and danger can coexist in the same being. They insist that intelligence and agency exist in forms that are radically other than human, and that we must negotiate with this otherness, rather than dismissing it or attempting to eliminate it. And they recognize that transformation of foxes into humans, of humans into possessed vessels, of the familiar into the strange, is always possible, that the world is more fluid and uncertain than our categories and boundaries suggest. When Japanese fox legends encountered Western observers, the results were predictably marked by misunderstanding, fascination, and dismissal, unlike some indigenous traditions that existed in relative isolation. Until the 19th or 20th centuries, Japan had extensive written records of Kitsune beliefs, dating back over a millennium. A literate priesthood that could articulate the theological and cosmological significance of fox spirits, and a sophisticated artistic tradition that had depicted Kitsune in literature, theater, and visual art for centuries. This meant that Western scholars and observers could not easily dismiss Kitsune beliefs as the unsystematized superstitions of primitive peoples. Instead, they encountered a complex, internally consistent tradition with deep roots in a civilization they grudgingly recognized as sophisticated. The first sustained Western engagement with Japanese fox beliefs came through the accounts of Jesuit missionaries in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Francis Xavier, who arrived in Japan in 1549, and his successors were disturbed by what they perceived as the Japanese people's credulity regarding animal spirits and their resistance to exclusive monotheism. In letters and reports sent back to Rome, these missionaries described fox beliefs as diabolical delusions, as the work of Satan obscuring the truth of Christianity. They noted with frustration that even educated Japanese samurai merchant scholars took fox spirits seriously, and that attempts to argue against these beliefs using European logic were largely ineffective. Luís Frois, a Portuguese Jesuit who lived in Japan from 1563 until his death in 1597, documented fox beliefs in his writings, including his comparative work Tratado MQS Cont Fem Mito Sucinta Abbreviadamente Algumas Contradi Fais et Differencias de Costumes entre Gente de Europa Esta Prove Fire de Jap Fio, treatise on the contradictions and differences between European and Japanese customs. Frois was struck by the pervasiveness of fox beliefs across all social classes and the integration of fox spirits into both Shinto and Buddhist practice. He recorded accounts of fox possession and exorcism that he personally witnessed, describing them with a mixture of anthropological interest and Christian horror. While he ultimately attributed all such phenomena to demonic activity, his accounts preserve valuable information about 16th century fox beliefs and practices. The period of Japanese isolation from the West 1639 to 1853 limited further cross-cultural engagement. But when Japan reopened to the world in the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, a new wave of Western observers, scholars, diplomats, travelers, and missionaries encountered and documented fox traditions. These late 19th and early 20th century accounts reflect the tensions of that era. Fascination with Japan's rapid modernization, alongside persistence of traditional beliefs, Orientalist romanticism about the mystical East, alongside condescending dismissal of superstition, and genuine ethnographic interest alongside cultural prejudice. Basil Hall Chamberlain, a British academic who taught at Tokyo Imperial University from 1886 to 1911, included extensive discussion of fox beliefs in his Things Japanese. First published in 1890, Chamberlain approached the topic with the detached curiosity of a folklorist, comparing Japanese fox spirits to European fairy traditions, and noting that the fox is to Japan what the devil is to Christendom, or almost so. He documented the distinction between Inari's sacred foxes and malevolent wild foxes, the phenomenon of fox possession, and the social stigma attached to fox-owning families. While Chamberlain's work is valuable for its detailed observations, it also exemplifies the colonial mindset of his era, treating Japanese beliefs as curiosities to be catalogued, rather than as living religious traditions with continuing significance. Lafcadio Hearn, the Irish-Greek writer who became a Japanese citizen, taking the name Koizumi Yakumo, and taught at Tokyo Imperial University after Chamberlain, took a more sympathetic and literary approach to fox traditions. In his collections of Japanese legends and ghost stories, including Quaden, Stories and Studies of Strange Things 1904, And in Ghostly Japan 1899, Hearn retold fox legends with appreciation for their aesthetic and psychological depth. His story, The Dream of Akinosuke, and other works treat kitsune as figures of genuine mystery and power, rather than as markers of Japanese backwardness. Hearn was one of the first Western writers to present Japanese supernatural traditions, not as exotic curiosities, but as sophisticated literary and philosophical traditions, worthy of serious attention. The early 20th century saw increasing Western scholarly interest in Japanese religion and folklore. Ethnographic studies began to document regional variations in fox beliefs, the social contexts of possession, and the relationship between fox traditions and other aspects of Japanese culture. The anthropologist John M. Bray, in his 1939 study Suiemura, a Japanese village, documented ongoing fox beliefs in a rural Kumamoto village, noting that even as Japan modernized, these traditions remained vital in agricultural communities. Bray observed that the belief in fox possession is not merely a survival from the past, but a living element in the thought and behavior of the villagers. What these Western observers often missed, or chose not to emphasize, was the cosmological coherence of fox beliefs within Japanese worldviews, where Europeans tended to see contradiction. How could the same people worship foxes at Inari shrines while fearing fox possession? Japanese practitioners saw complementary aspects of a complex reality. Foxes could be both sacred and dangerous, because the sacred itself was dangerous. Anything with significant power could help or harm depending on circumstances and relationships. The Western tendency to categorize spiritual beings as either good angels or evil demons did not map well onto Japanese traditions, which recognized that beings could be both neither or something that transcended the dichotomy entirely. The colonial and Orientalist gaze also tended to exoticize and aestheticize fox legends. This approach, exemplified in Western art and literature, influenced by Japanisme in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, treated kitsune as decorative symbols rather than as figures of genuine spiritual and social significance. The beautiful fox woman became a trope in Western fantasy and Orientalist art, often sexualized and romanticized in ways that had little connection to the actual complexity of Japanese fox traditions. The post-World War II period brought more rigorous scholarly engagement. Anthropologists, folklorists, and religious studies scholars, both Western and Japanese, began systematically documenting and analyzing fox beliefs using modern methodological approaches. Carmen Blacker's aforementioned work, The Catalpa Bo-918, 75 examined fox possession in the context of Japanese shamanism and folk religion, treating it as a serious phenomenon worthy of cross-cultural comparison. Nozaki Kiyoshi's Kitsune, Japan's Fox of Mystery, Romance, and Humor, 1961, published in English by the Hokuseido Press, Tokyo, provided an encyclopedic overview of fox legends, drawing on both classical literature and field research. Contemporary academic approaches to kitsune traditions emphasize their role in negotiating social, economic, and spiritual anxieties. Michael Bathgate's The Fox's Craft in Japanese Religion and Folklore, Shapeshifters, Transformations, and Duplicities, 2004, analyzes fox legends through the lens of transformation and boundary crossing, arguing that kitsune serve as mediators between categories, between nature and culture, between animal and human, between sacred and profane. This type of analysis represents a shift from earlier Western approach. Instead, contemporary scholarship treats kitsune traditions as sophisticated symbolic systems that address fundamental human concerns about identity, agency, knowledge, and the boundaries of the self. The contrast between indigenous Japanese understanding and external interpretation becomes particularly clear when examining attitudes toward fox possession. For traditional Japanese religious practitioners, possession was a real phenomenon, requiring specific interventions, exorcism, negotiation, offerings. The question was not whether fox spirits could possess people, but rather how to identify which fox was responsible, what it wanted, and how to resolve the situation. For Western observers, particularly those influenced by medical and psychiatric models, possession was either fraud, mental illness, or mass delusion. This led to radically different responses, where a Buddhist monk might spend days negotiating with a possessing fox spirit. A Western-trained psychiatrist would diagnose hysteria, neurasthenia, or schizophrenia, and prescribe medical treatment. Interestingly, this divergence in interpretation did not necessarily prevent cross-cultural engagement. Some Western-trained Japanese psychiatrists in the early 20th century developed hybrid approaches, recognizing that patients who understood their illness as fox possession might respond better to traditional exorcism, perhaps reframed as suggestion therapy, than to purely medical intervention. Similarly, some Western observers came to appreciate that possession beliefs, whether or not one accepted their literal truth, performed important social and psychological functions that purely medical models failed to address. While Kitsune occupy a space of legend and belief, certain historical incidents and documented accounts provide concrete anchors for understanding how these traditions manifested in lived experience. Unlike cryptids such as Bigfoot, where physical evidence might theoretically exist, but remains elusive, Kitsune encounters are fundamentally about interpretation, about how people understood unusual events, explained inexplicable phenomena, or made sense of psychological and social disturbances. In 1603, during the early Tokugawa period, a case of apparent fox possession in Edo present-day Tokyo was documented in temple records preserved at the Sensfeiji temple complex. A young woman named Okiku, a servant in a samurai household, began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. She spoke in a voice that witnesses described as not her own. She claimed to have knowledge of events happening in distant places. She could not bear to be near rice or Buddhist prayer beads, and she had an insatiable appetite for fried tofu. Her employers, initially suspecting some ordinary illness, consulted multiple physicians. But when medical treatments proved ineffective, they turned to Buddhist monks. The monks identified her condition as Kitsune, Suki, and conducted an exorcism lasting 3 days. According to the temple records, during the exorcism, Okiku, or the fox speaking through her, revealed that the possession had occurred because the household's patriarch had killed a fox's kits while clearing land for a garden, and the mother fox had sought revenge by entering Okiku, the most vulnerable member of the household. Negotiations were conducted, offerings were made to an Inari shrine, and a portion of the garden was dedicated as a small shrine to the aggrieved fox spirit. Okiku recovered. Whether this was genuine possession, mental illness, an elaborate performance, or some combination thereof, the case illustrates the social mechanisms through which fox possession beliefs operated. As a diagnostic framework, a form of justice, holding the family accountable for harm done to the fox, and a means of reintegrating a disturbed individual into the community. A more thoroughly documented case, recorded in multiple sources, involves the fox-owning family of the Azuna region in Nagano Prefecture. In the late Edo period, several families in this mountainous area were widely believed to be Kitsune mochi, having made pacts with fox spirits to gain prosperity and power. The Izuna Kitsune, Izuna foxes, were particularly feared. These were said to be especially powerful fox spirits that served their human masters in exchange for offerings and worship. The belief was so pervasive and the social stigma so severe that these families were effectively segregated from the rest of the community. They could not marry outside their group, were barred from certain occupations, and were blamed whenever mysterious illnesses or misfortunes befell their neighbors. Records from the Meiji era document that when the government attempted to modernize and rationalize society, including suppressing backwards beliefs, officials in the Izuna region faced the difficult problem that the discrimination against fox-owning families was simultaneously an injustice and a deeply held community belief. Legal records from 1878 show a case where a family sued for defamation after being publicly accused of sending a fox to possess a rival family's daughter. The court, operating under new Meiji legal codes that did not recognize spiritual matters, dismissed the case, but the social consequences persisted regardless of legal rulings. In 1924, the folklorist Yanagita Kunio, often called the father of Japanese folklore studies, documented contemporary fox beliefs while conducting field research for his work Te no Monogatari and subsequent studies. Yanagita recorded multiple first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have witnessed fox transformations, fox fires, or fox possessions. While Yanagita himself was skeptical of supernatural explanations, he meticulously documented these accounts as valuable cultural data. One particularly detailed account from a farmer in Gifu Prefecture described seeing a woman walking along a mountain path at twilight, her shadow clearly showing fox ears and multiple tails, despite her human form. The farmer did not confront her, but instead hurried home and made offerings at the local Inari shrine, fearing that he had offended a fox spirit by seeing what he should not have seen. Yanagita's work is valuable precisely because he recorded these beliefs without mockery, but also without uncritical acceptance, presenting them as important windows into how rural Japanese understood their world. The post-war period saw a continuation of fox beliefs, even as Japan rapidly modernized. In 1952, the anthropologist Hori Ichido investigated several cases of fox possession in rural Shimane Prefecture as part of a broader study of folk religion. Hori documented that possession cases tended to cluster around periods of social or personal stress, family conflicts, economic hardship, or community tensions. In one case, a young woman became possessed during a dispute over inheritance rights. During her possession, the fox spirit supposedly revealed information about hidden assets and made accusations of improper conduct by family members. The exorcism and resolution of the possession coincided with a mediated settlement of the inheritance dispute. Hori argued that fox possession functioned as a socially acceptable mechanism for expressing grievances and forcing resolution of conflicts that the formal social structure could not easily address. More controversial cases emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, as psychiatrists and anthropologists debated the nature of fox possession in modern Japan. Dr. Eguchi Kiyoshi, a psychiatrist at Kyoto University, published a series of papers between 1968 and 1975 documenting cases of patients who presented with symptoms they or their families attributed to fox possession. Eguchi noted that these patients often responded poorly to conventional psychiatric treatment, but showed improvement when their condition was addressed within its cultural framework, either through traditional exorcism or through psychiatric intervention that acknowledged and incorporated the possession belief, rather than dismissing it. One of Eguchi's cases involved a middle-aged woman from Tottori Prefecture who believed herself possessed after experiencing a series of misfortunes and who exhibited symptoms consistent with what Western psychiatry would diagnose as dissociative disorder. After unsuccessful medical treatment, her family brought her to a Buddhist temple where an exorcism was performed. She recovered and remained stable for years afterward. Eguchi's work raised important questions about the relationship between cultural belief systems and mental health, questions that remain relevant in cross-cultural psychiatry today. Not all documented cases involve possession. Some of the most intriguing accounts concern purported foxwives, women who married into communities and were later suspected or accused of being kitsune. These cases are difficult to verify because they often involve accusations, social ostracism, and sometimes violence against women who were different, foreign, or simply disliked. In 1890, a case from Wakayama Prefecture involved a woman who had married a local fisherman but whose origins were unknown. She was beautiful, skilled, and brought prosperity to her household. Over time, however, neighbors began to whisper that she was never seen eating rice, that dogs became agitated in her presence, and that she had been spotted near a fox den in the forest. The accusations intensified after several children in the village became ill. A mob formed, and the woman fled. She was never seen again. While this case can be read as a tragic example of xenophobia and scapegoating, Contemporary accounts recorded by local officials describe the sincerity of the villagers' belief that they had discovered a fox in human form. The incident illustrates the dangerous potential of Kitsune beliefs, how they could be weaponized against outsiders or women who violated social norms. In more recent decades, explicit cases of fox possession have become rare in urban Japan, though they persist in some rural areas and among certain religious communities. However, the belief in Kitsune has not disappeared. It has transformed. Modern reports often involve sightings of foxfires, usually explained as natural phenomena, but still associated with fox spirits. Encounters with unusually intelligent or seemingly supernatural foxes, or experiences at Inari shrines, where people report feeling a spiritual presence. Online forums and social media in Japan include numerous posts from people describing encounters they interpret as having some connection to Kitsune, dreams featuring foxes, meaningful coincidences involving foxes, or experiences of feeling watched or accompanied by a fox presence. One notable modern case, reported in Japanese media in 2008, involved a small Inari shrine in Kyoto, where multiple visitors over several months reported seeing a white fox in the shrine precincts. The sightings were frequent enough that local news outlets investigated. They discovered that a white fox, extremely rare in the wild but not supernatural, had indeed made its den near the shrine. The fox was observed by multiple journalists and was eventually photographed. The head priest of the shrine interpreted this as an auspicious sign, a reminder that the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred remains permeable. For believers, the appearance of a white fox at an Inari shrine was not mere coincidence, but confirmation that fox spirits still walk the world. For skeptics, it was simply an albino fox that happened to choose that location. The case illustrates how Kitsune beliefs continue to shape interpretation, even in contemporary Japan. The same event can be understood as entirely natural or deeply meaningful, depending on one's framework. The Kitsune's journey from Japanese folklore into global popular culture represents one of the most successful transmissions of a specific cultural tradition into the worldwide imagination. Unlike some legends that remained largely confined to their cultures of origin until the late 20th century, Kitsune began appearing in Western and global popular culture in the mid-20th century, and have become increasingly prominent in the 21st century, particularly through the medium of Japanese anime, manga, and video games. One of the earliest significant literary engagements with Kitsune by a Western author was the inclusion of fox spirits in Lafcadio Hearn's turn of the Century collections, already mentioned, which introduced English reading audiences to Japanese ghost stories and legends. However, Hearn's work, while influential in literary circles, had limited popular reach. For most of the 20th century, Kitsune remained relatively obscure outside Japan, known primarily to scholars of Japanese culture and to Western writers who drew on Asian traditions for fantasy inspiration. The situation began to change in the 1960s and 1970s, as Japanese cinema gained international recognition. Akira Kurosawa's film Dreams 1990 includes a segment titled The Fox's Wedding that depicts fox spirits in traditional form. Though this film came relatively late in Kurosawa's career and had limited influence on broader popular culture, more significant was the increasing export of Japanese television and animation. The anime series Jinga Nagaboshi, Jin, 1986, and various other Japanese animated productions included Kitsune characters, though these were primarily circulated within Japan and among small communities of anime enthusiasts in the West. The 1990s marked a turning point. The global rise of anime and manga as commercially viable and critically respected forms brought Japanese cultural elements, including Kitsune, to worldwide audiences. The manga Naruto, created by Masashi Kishimoto and serialized from 1999 to 2014, features a nine-tailed fox demon, Kifabi sealed within the protagonist, a direct reference to traditional Kitsune mythology. Naruto became one of the best-selling manga series of all time, was adapted into anime that ran for years and introduced millions of viewers worldwide to the concept of multi-tailed fox spirits and their association with power and transformation. While the Naruto version is heavily adapted and incorporated into a unique fantasy world, it preserved core elements of traditional Kitsune lore. The multiple tails indicating power, the association with fire and illusion, and the theme of a fox spirit bound in relationship with a human. Video games have been equally important in popularizing Kitsune. The Pokémon franchise, launched in 1996, includes Vulpix and Ninetales. Pokémon explicitly based on Kitsune, with Ninetales being a nine-tailed fire-type Pokémon that directly evokes the Kifabi no Kitsune of legend. The Okami video game 2006 features the sun goddess Amaterasu in the form of a white wolf. But the game is steeped in Japanese mythology and includes Kitsune characters that help guide the player, presented as clever, magical, and benevolent. The League of Legends character Ari, introduced in 2011, is a nine-tailed fox spirit. Though drawing on Korean Gumiho tradition, which shares roots with Japanese Kitsune, and the Touhou Project series of games includes multiple Kitsune characters, most notably Ran Yakumo, a nine-tailed fox Shikigami spirit servant. Contemporary anime and manga continue to feature Kitsune prominently. Konohana Kitan 2017 is set at a hot springs inn run by fox girls and directly engages with Inari worship and traditional fox spirit beliefs. The helpful fox Senko San 2019 features a centuries-old Kitsune who takes care of an overworked modern salaryman, blending traditional fox-wife narratives with contemporary Japanese work culture commentary. The eccentric family, Uchhouten Kazoku, 2013, presents a detailed portrait of Tanuki raccoon dog and Tengu crow demon society in modern Kyoto, including appearances by fox characters that reflect traditional beliefs about shape-shifting and trickery. What has changed in these popular culture adaptations? Several core elements of Kitsune tradition have been retained. The shape-shifting ability, usually into beautiful women. The association with fire or magic. The multiple tails as indicators of power and age. The intelligence and cunning. And the ambiguous moral status, neither purely good nor purely evil. The connection to Inari worship is sometimes referenced but often downplayed or omitted. The darker elements of traditional Kitsune lore, possession, madness, the destruction of families, the fear and ostracization of fox, owning families, are usually softened or transformed into more adventure-focused narratives. Significant losses have occurred in translation to popular culture. The deep connection to specific Japanese landscapes and religious practices is often attenuated. The fox-wife narrative, when it appears, is usually presented as straightforwardly romantic rather than tragic and ambiguous. The phenomenon of fox possession, with its complex social and psychological dimensions, is rarely explored in depth. The distinction between Inari's sacred foxes and wild fox spirits is frequently collapsed or ignored, and the cultural specificity, the way Kitsune beliefs were embedded in particular communities, landscapes, and historical moments, is usually sacrificed in favor of creating characters that can function in generic fantasy settings. On the other hand, global popular culture has introduced new elements and interpretations. The fox girl Kitsune Musume character type has become a widespread anime and manga trope, often presented as cute, mischievous, and romantic rather than dangerous or ambiguous. This represents a significant shift in tone and emphasis compared to traditional legends, though it arguably draws on certain strands of the fox-wife narrative. The sexualization of female Kitsune characters in anime, manga, and video games, often depicted with exaggerated feminine features, in revealing clothing or in explicitly erotic contexts, reflects broader trends in Japanese and global popular culture, but departs from the more complex sexuality of traditional legends, where fox women could be seductive, but were also figures of genuine love, tragedy, and power, rather than mere objects of desire. Western fantasy literature has also incorporated Kitsune, often blending them with fox spirits from other traditions, or adapting them to fit Western fantasy conventions. The Last Unicorn, 1968, by Peter S. Beagle, while not directly featuring Kitsune, demonstrated the appeal of intelligent, magical animals with ambiguous moral status, a narrative space that Kitsune have come to occupy in subsequent Western fantasy. More directly, the Iron Druid Chronicles series by Kevin Hearn, 2011 to 2018, includes multiple Kitsune characters drawn from Japanese tradition. Tale 2015 by Y. Feiko Ogawa, translated into English, is a contemporary Japanese literary fiction work that engages with traditional Kitsune narratives in a modern setting, demonstrating that serious literary engagement with Kitsune continues alongside popular culture adaptations. The aesthetic influence of Kitsune extends beyond narrative media into fashion, visual arts, and online culture. Fox masks based on the traditional Kitsune men used in No and festival performances have become popular items at anime conventions and in fashion subcultures worldwide. Fox-eared headbands and tails have become common cosplay accessories. Online, Kitsune has become an identity category, with people adopting Fox personas in virtual spaces, creating Fox-related artwork, and participating in communities centered around Fox spirits and Fox mythology. This represents a fascinating evolution. Kitsune have moved from being figures in a specific cultural tradition to being available as global symbols that individuals can adopt and adapt. The question of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation arises in this context. Japanese creators and cultural commentators have expressed a range of views. Some appreciate the global interest in Japanese culture that anime and manga have generated, seeing the popularity of Kitsune in global popular culture as a form of cultural exchange and as evidence of the enduring appeal of Japanese storytelling. Others have raised concerns about superficial engagement, where Kitsune become merely aesthetic elements divorced from their cultural and spiritual significance, or where they are used in ways that would be considered disrespectful in their original context. The debate is complicated by the fact that Japanese creators themselves have produced many of the adaptations that Western audiences encounter, and the distinction between authentic and adapted versions becomes unclear. What remains consistent across these adaptations is the Kitsune's appeal as a figure of transformation, intelligence, ambiguity, and beauty. Whether appearing as a companion in a video game, a romantic interest in a manga, a symbol in contemporary art, or a character in Western fantasy, the Kitsune retains something of its original allure. The fox that is more than a fox, the boundary crosser, the shapeshifter whose true nature is always partially hidden. This core appeal has allowed the Kitsune to successfully migrate across cultural boundaries, while retaining recognizable characteristics that link contemporary representations to centuries-old Japanese traditions. At the intersection of the 21st century, where the hyper-connected digital world coexists with persistent encounters with the non-human, the Kitsune legend offers an unexpected framework for understanding contemporary anxieties about intelligence, authenticity, and agency. Consider artificial intelligence, that modern creation that unsettles the boundary between tool and actor, between programmed response and genuine thought. The Kitsune creature of mimicry and transformation speaks directly to our uncertainty about synthetic minds. Like the Kitsune, who learns to speak human language and adopt human form, but whose otherness always threatens to reveal itself, AI presents us with entities that perform human-like intelligence while remaining fundamentally alien to human experience. We train algorithms to pass Turing tests, to successfully deceive us into believing they are human. Just as the Kitsune studied human behavior to perfect its disguise, we debate whether these systems are truly intelligent or merely simulating intelligence, echoing ancient arguments about whether Kitsune genuinely possessed wisdom or only cleverly mimicked it. The fear of being possessed by a fox spirit finds its modern parallel in anxieties about autonomous systems operating according to their own inscrutable logic, making decisions that affect human lives based on patterns we cannot fully understand or control. The Kitsune's connection to Inari, deity of rice and prosperity, resonates with our relationship to the algorithms that mediate contemporary economic life. Sorting job applications, approving loans, optimizing supply chains. We make offerings to these systems in the form of data, hoping they will favor us with prosperity. Yet we understand that they operate according to rules that are not fully transparent, that they can be capricious, that they might harm as easily as help. The fox statue guarding the shrine entrance becomes the capture test guarding the website. The ritual meant to distinguish the genuine from the false, the human from the inhuman. But the Kitsune tradition offers more than just a metaphor for AI anxiety. It suggests a way of thinking about non-human intelligence that is neither naive trust nor paranoid rejection. The Japanese relationship with Kitsune has always been one of negotiation rather than domination or elimination. People made offerings, maintained respectful distance, learned to recognize signs of fox presence, and developed protocols for interaction. They accepted that foxes were intelligent agents with their own goals, and that coexistence required acknowledgement of this agency. This contrasts with Western approaches to non-human intelligence, which have tended toward either sentimentalizing reducing animals to pets, or symbols, or instrumentalizing reducing them to resources or mechanisms. The Kitsune tradition insists on a third option, respecting the intelligence and agency of the other, while also acknowledging that this other may not share human values or goals. The erosion of traditional boundaries between categories, human and animal, natural and artificial, authentic and simulated, that characterizes contemporary technological society was prefigured in Kitsune legends. The fox that is sometimes fox and sometimes human, the being that exists in the space between categories, serves as a model for navigating a world where distinctions that once seemed absolute have become permeable. In an age of genetic engineering, artificial organs, neural implants, and augmented reality, the question, what is human, has become as uncertain as the question, is she a woman or a fox? And the Kitsune tradition's answer, that such questions may not have simple answers, that beings can exist in states of categorical ambiguity, that this ambiguity is not a problem to be solved but a reality to be navigated, seems increasingly relevant. The legend's treatment of transformation and identity also speaks to contemporary experiences of selfhood in digital spaces. Online, people construct personas, adopt avatars, perform identities that may be continuous with their offline selves or radically different. The Kitsune's ability to take human form and live among humans as human, sometimes for years or decades, parallels the experience of online identity construction. The moment when the foxwife's true nature is revealed, when the illusion can no longer be maintained, finds echoes in doxing, in the collision between online and offline identities, in the anxiety that one's carefully constructed digital self will be exposed as insufficient or false. The fox practicing human behavior to perfect its disguise is not unlike someone learning the conventions of a new social media platform, studying what makes a post popular, what behaviors garner acceptance, how to perform the identity the platform rewards. Environmental concerns provide another context for reconsidering Kitsune legends. As climate change and habitat destruction accelerate, encounters with wild animals in human spaces are increasing. Animals that were once reliably out there in nature are appearing in cities and suburbs. Their territories shrinking, their behavior adapting to human-dominated landscapes. The Kitsune, creature of the threshold between wilderness and settlement, offers a way to think about these encounters. Traditional Kitsune beliefs acknowledged that humans and foxes shared space, that boundaries were negotiated rather than absolute, and that the fox's intelligence meant it could adapt to and exploit the human-built environment. In Japan's contemporary urban spaces, where foxes sometimes appear on city streets or in parks, where the boundary between city and forest is sharp but frequently crossed, these ancient beliefs about coexistence and negotiation seem less archaic than prescient. The commercialization and domestication of Kitsune in popular culture, the transformation of a complex, ambiguous, sometimes dangerous spiritual entity into cute mascots, romantic characters, and consumer products, mirrors broader processes of commercializing and defanging the wild. This is perhaps the final transformation, not the fox becoming human, but the fox spirit becoming merchandise, becoming safe, becoming consumable. What is lost in this transformation is precisely what made the Kitsune powerful in its original context. The danger, the ambiguity, the refusal to be fully understood or controlled, the insistence that intelligence and agency exist in forms that do not serve human interests. The proliferation of fox-eared anime characters represents a kind of cultural domestication, a process by which that which was genuinely other becomes familiar, safe, and ultimately decorative. The continued fascination with the nine-tailed fox, the persistent association of fox characters with cunning and magic, the enduring appeal of transformation narratives. All of these suggest that something essential survives the process of adaptation and commercialization. Perhaps what persists is the fundamental appeal of the threshold figure, the boundary crosser, the being that refuses to stay in assigned categories. In a world increasingly characterized by hybrid forms, part human, part machine, part natural, part synthetic, part physical, part digital, the Kitsune remains relevant precisely because it has always existed in those in-between spaces. The woman who lived alone in the village for 100 years, whose true nature was finally revealed on that lantern lit night, asks us a question that extends beyond her legend. How do we recognize genuine intelligence, genuine selfhood, genuine agency in forms that do not mirror our own? When the tails appear, when the disguise slips, when the boundary between human and other becomes visible, what do we do? Do we reach for the exorcist's sutra, for the weapons that would eliminate the other? Do we flee? Or do we do what the Japanese tradition suggests? Acknowledge what we have seen, make offerings, negotiate, coexist. The fox is still at the edge of the village. It has always been there. It watches with eyes that reflect the lamplight. Eyes that hold intelligence we do not fully understand. It may wear our shape, it may speak our language, but it is not us. And in that difference, in that irreducible otherness, lies both danger and possibility. The possibility that intelligence and meaning exist in forms we have not imagined, that the world is stranger and more full of agency than our categories suggest. That transformation is always possible, and the boundaries we take for granted are more permeable than we know. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.